Norma, when you're ready.
Greetings, you all. It's so nice to have you join us. This is our first special book signing event and discussion group, which is featuring our beloved Max Alvarez, whom you've seen before on on all of our discussion groups, actually. Max first published his book on June 1 of this year, so we're very excited. This book is hot off the press, and I think you'll find it enjoyable, delightful, and the discussion enjoyable and delightful as well. I'm Norma Levy. I'm New Plaza's president. New Plaza is, as you know, a nonprofit organization that's been providing independent and foreign film to the Upper West Side of Manhattan for the past 2 years, following the closing of Lincoln Plaza, that wonderful art house that had been around for 30 years. Because this is an unusual format for us, I'll tell you a little bit about how we're going to proceed today. There's no film to watch, of course, and you don't yet have your book. But I will soon be sending you over to Gary Palmucci, our curator, who will introduce Max, and Max will then speak for about 25 minutes or so about the book and what's in it, and that will be followed by a conversation between Gary and Max, like the conversation that they've been used to having over the past several months. And at the very end, we will be sure we have lots of time available for you to ask your questions, to make your comments. We really appreciate having them, and they've been exceptional in the past, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. So with that said, let me turn it over to Gary.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to our new visitors. This is a special edition of the New Plaza Cinema Podcast, as Norma told you, and I'm going to dispense with any personal anecdotes this afternoon and try to move quickly to Max's audio-visual presentation, which he's meticulously prepared for us to tell us about his new book. Now, I've known Max for, I would say, about 25 years now. I met him through his brother, Louis Alvarez, who's a very well-respected documentary filmmaker, perhaps deserves to be a little better known in America as such. And we instantly got on the same page about our likes and dislikes of film and film history. And sometimes a few years would go by, I wouldn't see Max for one reason or another. But when we saw each other again, we always were able to immediately get back on the same page or the same wavelength. And I think you'll see that this afternoon as well. So Max, we're going to hear from Max when we speak a little bit later about what I think is, to me, a remarkable piece of gumshoe film journalism, which deserves to be told in full detail. But Max, first of all, good afternoon and the book.
Thank you, Gary, and good afternoon, everyone. I was such an honor and so flattered to be asked by the New Plaza Cinema to have this event today, partially as a fundraiser for this wonderful organization that is determined to bring, get back into a screening space to fill that void left by our lamented Lincoln Plaza Cinemas. So thank you all for this kind invitation. And those of you who are attending, I'm also very grateful that we're operating on the honor system today. You're trusting me by being here today with having written a book that you don't have and probably haven't read yet. But I assure you, there is a book, and it will be coming in the mail to you. We're catching up with the shipments due to some of the delays. But just what I'll be doing is just talking a little bit about what was it about that led me to write the book. And it's a number of factors. I have been giving film history talks now for 22 years, starting in Washington, D.C. for the Smithsonian Institution. And in looking back on the 80 plus topics I've lectured on over the years in various parts of the country, especially here in New York, I noticed the same names keep cropping in to my conversation. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking about Hollywood, musicals or suspense films or political films or movies during the Cold War, screenwriting, cinematography, editing. There's these certain number of very essential directors. Since this is Father's Day, in many ways, these are the fathers of Hollywood cinema of the mid to late, of the early to mid 1950s. And I decided that I would pay tribute to at least 9 of these directors, although technically there are a lot more directors mentioned in other sections of the book, which I'll give you more information on. So, and also another reason for the book is, believe it or not, I had no idea there was a pandemic thing coming on a year ago when I wrote this. I had planned to have something to make available at my lectures. But now that we have been dealing with a lot of quarantine issues, we're waiting for stage 4 cinemas to open. I know that a lot of people are probably getting a little tired of Netflix and Hulu. And also, it's just our culture in general is in danger of being forgotten if we don't remember its major artistes and practitioners. And one of the main reasons for the book is to make sure that these names are not forgotten. These films are not forgotten, and to provide readers with ways to see the films easier. So that those were contributing factors to the book. So let me take you a little bit through what you'll eventually be seeing. The Cinephile's Guide. The book is 191 pages, and the chapters are brief chapters. They're not really long chapters, but the first 9 chapters are going to be focusing on these directors that I highlighted. We're going to talk a little bit about their backgrounds, what makes their films of great value, how is their outlook unique or different from their contemporaries, and why is their work so important to us today. And this is a case of John Huston, who I'll talk about a little bit more momentarily. And at the end of each chapter, I think this is important, there are recommended films for people to see. These are some of the outstanding films that John Huston made, for example, when they came out, and who offers them on DVD or Blu-ray. There's many are available on streaming, but not all of them. So and I try to provide the best sources for you so that you'll know when you watch the film that you're not getting some cheap bootleg that's not of very good quality. Equally important to each chapter is the recommended reading, recommended books about the subject. Not every book ever written, because some are better than others, but things that will help you to move forward if you want to learn more about the subject matter. Now, when I get to a part of the book that has to do with themes and genres, we're going to talk about people who did important contributions to those genres. For example, film noir, the crime movie, which I'll be talking about. I have a section towards the end of that chapter highlighting key directors who made outstanding films in that genre and where you can find their films, just to make it a little more easier for you, because it can be truly overwhelming. One of my favorite sections, it's on what I call pre-code movies. These are movies made before Hollywood enforced its censorship code. And there are so many fantastic actors and actresses who really, were it not for like Turner Classic Movies, they'd be completely forgotten today. Yet they did such extraordinary work. And I will be sharing with you who some of those key performers are, what are some of the movies that are interesting, and where you can locate them. And I'll be talking more about that genre as well. And then the last section, it's a technical tutorial, because there's so much more to watching movies is complicated, because the size of the screen changes, especially at a certain point in the 20th century. It switches from square to rectangular or to semi-rectangular. And if you don't know that going in, you can sometimes become victimized by a DVD company or by a streaming service. Even Netflix or HBO may be transmitting the film in the incorrect way. And so this little section is designed to help people become a little bit more cinematically comfortable in, we talk about aspect ratio, the size of the picture, and things that I think will enhance the home viewing experience if you can't get to the cinema. So that's kind of in a nutshell, a little bit about the book. Now, what I'm going to do now is take us through the actual chapters, and yes, these are my illustrations. I did the drawings for each director, and the subject and the genres in each of the chapters. And I started with Alfred Hitchcock. I hope this is a good picture, because I showed this to a young girl sometime last year, and she gave me a puzzled look, and she wants to go into film, so I'm a little nervous. But that's another story. Anyway, Hitch is a great way to start, because he is the most accessible of the iconic Hollywood, although technically British, directors. His work has endured because he has a very strong estate, but also because all the meticulous planning that went into his work, it pays off in the finished results. And I think even if people are not inclined to look at older films, Hitchcock is a good starting point to get them used to seeing them. And I think what's also unique about Alfred Hitchcock is he not only has a personality as a director, but also, sorry about that sound there, but also it has to do with his identity to the movie-going public by his appearance. Not only his name above the title, but the fact that he always, not always, but at least for most of his films, had cameo appearances in his movies as sort of a cinematic signature. So audiences came to know Hitchcock by his appearance. I mean, he worked the media well. He was what we would call a franchise or a brand name today. People expected the Hitchcock cameo. And of course, once he started appearing on television in the mid-50s, he became a celebrity. So he really became a star director. And that's quite remarkable for a country such as ours, which does not treat directors as stars, as say they often do in other countries like France, where the man or woman directing is just as important as the actors in it. Hitchcock and just a small number of others have been that exception. So that's the start of the book, and that I thought was a good starting point for the Cinephile's Guide, is to start off with Hitchcock and give people a sense as to what his background was, his personal background, his professional background, his career, and the important things about his films, which I find value to all of us. Now, a director who also comes up quite a bit, we think of him really more as a screenwriter, but he had just as much control over his work as Hitchcock. I mean, he was Billy Wilder, who we know today for his outrageous farces like Some Like It Hot, and his comedy dramas like The Apartment, and others with his peak was from the early 40s to really the early to mid 60s. He kept going, but that was his most successful period, at least commercially. Wilder really controlled his work. And what I always find remarkable about Billy Wilder is here was an emigre who spoke virtually no English when he came to the United States, fleeing Nazism in the 1930s. And you swore by the scripts that he wrote and the films he went on to direct, once he mastered the language, that he was born here, because his films have such an American slang and vernacular to them. He worked with some terrific writers, but he really understood this strange culture that became his own. There are several Billy Wilders. There are the Billy Wilders of melodramas like The Lost Weekend. There are Billy Wilders of madcap comedies like The Major and the Minor, Some Like It Hot. There are the film noir Billy Wilders of Double Indemnity and Ace in the Hole. A remarkably gifted, towering Hollywood figure who is worthy of rediscovering time and again. The third person, when we get to chapter 3 in the book, Who are we talking about? We're leaving the United States for a while for another remarkable filmmaker, Akira Kurosawa, who, when you look back, it's quite astonishing that a Japanese filmmaker, only 5 years after World War II, could gain not so much international recognition, but such recognition and respect in the United States, considering the horrific war that we waged on Japan and the politics of that. Kurosawa brought light to the Japanese film industry. He also ushered in a remarkable generation of other Japanese filmmakers in our mind. We got to learn about other Japanese filmmakers through our access to Kurosawa. There are several Kurosawas. There's the Kurosawa of the samurai action films, like The Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, Sanjuro, all starring his alter ego, the great Toshiro Mifune. There was the Kurosawa, the Shakespearean Kurosawa of Throne of Blood and Ron and let's see, those were the main ones. Those were the main ones. There was the philosophical, humane and humanitarian Kurosawa of films like Ikiru, a complicated director who I think is a great starting point for those to explore further the great cinema of Japan of the post-World War II years. And then we get to a man who I just talked about the other day. I consider him, he may be the most maligned and misunderstood film geniuses of all time, Orson Welles. In the minds of most Americans, it started and ended at Citizen Kane, and nothing else happened after that. Well, that's not true. Orson Welles put his name on at least 12 more films and had involvement in at least another film, and that doesn't even count a series of unreleased films that came out. When I first spoke about Welles, there were a lot of question marks. Like 20 years ago, The Other Side of the Wind was not available. Thanks to Netflix, it now is, and proves to be an absolutely fascinating study of Hollywood in the 1970s. There were other works of his that needed to be restored or rediscovered. This was a man who, he was exiled by Hollywood, not entirely of his own doing, ended up becoming an independent filmmaker internationally, and doing some of his most challenging and artistically brilliant work overseas in the 50s and the 60s. And I'll be talking more about Orson after Citizen Kane. Francois Truffaut is the kid in the group. He's the youngest one. He's the most recent arrival, directing his first film in 1959. We showed it, or we discussed it several weeks ago at the New Plaza, The 400 Blows. Truffaut was our entry to France in the United States. He made French cinema accessible here during the 1960s and 70s. He died too young. His specialty was romantic dramas, films of a comic nature. He had his Hitchcockian movies, and of course he made Hitchcock a household name in many intellectual circles with his book-length interview on Hitchcock. Truffaut, of course, was a former film critic. So he is a wonderful way, if you're going to make your start to explore more French cinema, his films are a great way to begin from the 50s and 60s. John Huston, we got a little tease of the chapter. Strange filmography, very unpredictable. He was either brilliant or he was, I don't know what he was thinking when he chose some of these assignments. But boy, when he was on, he was on. There are several John Hustons. The John Huston directing Humphrey Bogart in The Maltese Falcon, Key Largo, The African Queen. The John Huston who did our intellectual biopics of Toulouse-Lautrec and Sigmund Freud. The John Huston who did very challenging intellectual adaptations of James Joyce and others. He was sort of the more legit version of Orson Welles. If Orson Welles could have navigated the studio system better, he would have been John Huston, but then he wouldn't have been Orson Welles. So Huston is a fascinating figure, and I do outline quite a number of outstanding films of his that are worth exploring right up until the early 1980s, around the time that he passed away. This is one of my favorites, Ernst Lubitsch. He goes back the furthest of the directors I talk about. If you've heard of Ernst Lubitsch, you've heard of him through Greta Garbo and Ninotchka. You may have heard of The Shop Around the Corner with James Stewart, which became a Broadway musical called She Loves Me, and then the Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan rom-com You've Got Mail. You may have heard of To Be or Not to Be with Jack Benny, which was an anti-Nazi comedy of the early 40s. Those aren't the ones that interest me. Yes, they're wonderful films, but the Lubitsch I love is the Lubitsch of Paramount in the late 20s, early 30s. Very sophisticated operettas or comedies of manners starring Maurice Chevalier, Jeanette MacDonald. We had Herbert Marshall in Trouble in Paradise. Lubitsch specialized in comedies of the sexes, usually set in the upper crust in royalty. He's satirizing the privileged classes and their ridiculous relations with each other, especially male and female. He started out as an actor and a filmmaker in Germany in the silent years. A number of his silent comedies are available on DVD or YouTube. They're very funny and worth pursuing, as are other films that he's made. So Lubitsch, they call it the Lubitsch touch, and it's certainly a memorable touch. And Billy Wilder was a disciple of Lubitsch. Lubitsch was one of Wilder's mentors. Federico Fellini, Italy's eccentric genius, was our gateway to Italy after World War II. He started out somewhat as a neo-realist director and then became more elaborate and stylistic with his fantasy looks at everything from decadence to male-female relations to Catholicism. La Dolce Vita being his biggest hit in 1960 with Marcello Mastroianni. The last director needs no introduction, although these days it seems like he's getting a lot. Charlie Chaplin. When he was active in the 20s and in the teens, he was probably the most famous man in the world. Writer, producer, director, comedy giant of the silent screen, who then transitioned to sound brilliantly with such provocative films as The Great Dictator and Monsieur Verdoux. Chaplin has gotten lost in the shuffle sometimes, being overshadowed by other comedians, and then by media backbiting in relation to everyone's private lives. But his is a cinema worth rediscovering, and particularly introducing young audiences and children to, because there's so much there to learn and to experience pleasure from. And then very briefly, we have the themes and genres section of the book. The themes and genres is going to start out with a section on film noir. This amazing genre, not exclusively Hollywood. They made these kinds of films, these very gritty black and white crime pictures. They made them in France. They made them in Japan. They made them in Mexico. I believe they may have even made some in Egypt, and they definitely made them in England. But there was a certain style of film that came out starting the late 30s and into the early 60s that captured, they could deal with social and political issues, crime. They were really extraordinary films that, while not taken seriously by their studios, were taken very seriously by the people who wrote them, directed them, and starred in them. And I will be introducing you to a number of important directors responsible for these film noir films. This particular illustration is from Otto Preminger's Laura. One of our favorites here at New Plaza Cinema is the musical genre, and that's Gene Kelly and Singing in the Rain. My big goal is to get men, tough, macho, beer-drinking men to love musicals. And I hope I do justice to the genre by talking about its history and by the key artists who were performing and also even directing these great films. The focus is going to be on the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That is the second chapter on genres. The final chapter on genre in the book, the one I alluded to earlier, is on pre-code movies. These are films that were made roughly between 1931 and 1934, before the Hollywood censorship code got enforced. The studios had signed onto it, but had ignored it. And so you have these 4 years of amazing, really caustic, edgy, sexy, hard-boiled sometimes shocking dramas made at the height of the Great Depression. They touch on political issues. They deal with a lot of taboo themes, a lot of social taboos. They have it was probably the richest role for women in Hollywood history. The women's roles got kind of boring after this phase ended. And these were movies with Barbara Stanwyck and Lee Tracy and James Cagney and so many others. I think you'll have a lot of fun in that chapter. So this gives us an idea of the book. I think it'll be a lot of fun and a great way to reintroduce ourselves to the classics, to share with others the classics. And it's also just easier to have one source to go to, because people are often asking me when I roll my eyes at their loving the latest Marvel Universe movie, well, Max, what do you think we should be watching? I think this is a good step in that direction to at least share films that I think are a good way to start expanding our cinematic literacy. And I thought a great way to wrap things up would be to leave you with the great Charlie Chaplin.
Well, thank you, Max.
Thank you, Gary.
As usual. That's Charlie Chaplin's The Circus, which I think is actually one of his films that deserves a little more recognition and attention than it, I think, has gotten. But
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
All of these directors, I think we have 9 chapters. They're all together in the book. They're all favorites of mine. They all continue to inspire me and make me laugh sometimes. But we have to, before we discuss them a little bit, hear the story about your first book, which you published now, I think, almost 40 years ago. Is that correct?
Thanks for that depressing reminder. Actually, it's 38, Gary. Okay, let's not push things here. No, I'll tell you a crazy story. You have to be a dumb teenager to even embark on this. My first book has the sexiest title, Index to Motion Pictures Reviewed by Variety, 1907 to 1980. That really makes you want to run out and buy it. But it's a reference book for libraries. And it came out when I was in my early 20s, and this was before computers. And I literally was going into a library and looking at microfilm and cranking through the magazines to locate reviews, writing them on index cards, putting them in shoe boxes, and then typing them into a manuscript form, which then got retyped. So
here is Variety, having performed this incredible cultural and historical public service for like 70 years, reviewing films from all around the world. In some cases, many American films that the New York Times did not cover because they opened on 42nd Street or were considered, below the radar of Bosley Crowther and their other critics. And yet, this publication, its editors and publishers probably didn't think of it in the same way that we did, but they had no morgue, they had no index, they had no systematic organization of these reviews. So you took it upon yourself to hit the microfilm and any other sources that, long before the internet, to try to pull this together.
Yeah, and I have to say it was the greatest film education I could have had. I mean, when you're going through 70 years of microfilm on show business history, you're going to pick up some colorful stuff, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. But thank you for mentioning that.
Well, it's always kind of fascinated me because I was also an early reader of Variety as a teenager, and amazed at the breadth of reviews from all around the world. And yet you could not really go back and try to find out when they had the original reviews had appeared and read them. So it's eventually Variety did put together some bound volumes, probably inspired by your book.
It was. They tried to stop my book, and they realized they didn't have a legal leg to stand on. So they
Yeah, I don't imagine there's any copyright restrictions on something like that.
But what's fascinating is it's always fascinating to read what the trade had to say about all these films. I'm talking about all these directors. When they reviewed a Truffaut film or a Kurosawa film or a Fellini film, they always reviewed it from the original film festival where it was shown for the first time. And it's fascinating because it's strictly a commercial opinion. Oh, this might do well in the U.S. It might not, or they might not even like or be underwhelmed by a Hitchcock film. But
right, I think Variety's correspondent who covered Cannes and after World War II, he was an ex-GI basically who fell into the job. He had no particular, probably wasn't even a college grad or anything. But in fact, some good horse sense in those reviews. Not all the time, but some of the time.
And they're unpretentious. But the directors in question came out. It's hard to think of a time where directors had such stature. Directors of such stature came out, and even in a show business paper, we're treated with such respect. Today, yes, you do have the rock star directors, but in terms of the intellectual stature that these directors had, that's gone today, and that's why I think it's important for us not to forget who these men were and the important work that they did.
We certainly miss like the slashing mordant wit of Billy Wilder, certainly in today's times. There are numerous fabulous one-liners or things that come up in the studies and interviews with Billy. I remember there's an interview in Film Comment magazine. You probably read this back in the early '80s, where he's interviewed in his office in L.A. And there's Billy, someone whose family did not survive World War II in Germany, had a picture of Hitler up on his bulletin board with a kosher delicatessen menu from a local LA restaurant thumbtacked into Hitler's crotch. That was,
that sounds very Billy Wilder.
Yeah.
And he was a dangerous. I mean, he was one director who could be very. He used the commercial sphere to be subversive, and he got to let it. He got away with an awful lot. Listen. I mean, he made a sarcastic comedy about the Nazism 3 years after the end of World War II. He did A Foreign Affair, which makes fun of the U.S. occupation of Berlin. And that offended a lot of people in the government, and he pushed the envelope there. Lubitsch pushed the envelope. Chaplin, of course, pushed the political envelope. Hitchcock was more subtle in that approach. I think more in his television programming, he got a little riskier. But all these directors, and Fellini as well, they took risks in a commercial format to, I think, comment a lot about what was going on in the world, and in particularly their societies and cultures.
Hitchcock would occasionally direct one of the hundreds of television shows that he produced and hosted over the years. Do you remember the one called Lamb to the Slaughter?
That's the most famous. I would give away the premise, but I want people to be able to see it. It's with Barbara Bel Geddes, and I believe it's based on a Cornell Woolrich short story where a lamb chop is used as a weapon. It's very entertaining. He did some very good television films. I think that he liked the television medium because he liked the fact that a story didn't have to end happily. He felt with a feature film it had to be more upbeat because people were leaving their homes and buying a ticket. On TV, he could be a little darker. And the themes of his television programs, even once he didn't direct it, much different from a lot of the films.
Right. I think he directed about 20 or so episodes over the years, and I think those series are in pretty good circulation.
They're most. I think 6 out of the 7, or 5 out of the 7 half-hour series you can get in this country. The 6 and 7 you have to get from England. The Alfred Hitchcock Hour is only available overseas. I mean, there's still some work to be done here. It helps if you have a multi-region DVD.
Yes, it does.
Unfortunately,
or whatever. Now,
exactly.
You were talking, and I think it's great you get into this whole issue of aspect ratios and video presentation, because there's still a lot of things I think that even serious filmgoers may not necessarily be aware of, and to make sure they're getting, the accurate rendition of a film. But there's also some tricky aspects to this too. We were talking yesterday about Psycho, and the fact that Psycho was kind of shot quickly with a television crew and was actually framed in the television ratio, even though, but in such a way that it could be presented in theaters, like the clip you showed, without drastic mitigation of the image. But in fact, some people think that the boxy image of a film like Psycho, or like On the Waterfront, or certain pictures in that transitional period from the 50s into the 60s should at least be available, that they are legitimate, representations and very interesting. You see information that's in some ways critical that you don't see on a big screen version.
I think people should have the option. I think that at some DVD companies, there are very responsible people like Criterion who care. When you get to the studios, it's a coin toss. They grab whatever materials they have and they put them on DVD, and sometimes it's the wrong shape. And like you're describing, in the case of Psycho, the thing is that people have to be careful what they ask for. In the shower scene, if you see it as a square, there's going to be a black bar at the bottom where to cut off Janet Leigh's nudity. So in many ways, the slightly rectangular version won't be as distracting that way.
Right. Well, and to the great Criterion label, to their credit, I believe, and On the Waterfront, they give you 3 different renditions of the film.
Oh, wow.
Because of that very transitional period, from about 1953 or 54, when CinemaScope was just coming in, and 133, as we know it, like we've seen The Bandwagon, and next week's film, No Way Out, was beginning to be phased out as well.
Yeah, so there'll be a little, if people can learn a little bit more about that, and also just little things about when you're watching a movie on a certain flat screen TV, sometimes it has the soap opera effect, where it's digitally removed all the crispness of film, and it almost looks like a soap opera or a reality TV show. And there are ways to fix that on your TV, because to give the film more dignity that the filmmakers intend.
Yes. Well, and also you mentioned both Orson Welles and John Huston and The Other Side of the Wind, which I think Netflix, for all its pros and cons, deserves some credit for finally getting the film finished after literally 40 years of litigation and storage and just misdirection of one sort or another. And since Netflix produced it, it will probably be permanently available on the site. You don't have to worry about it leaving Netflix, like these notices we see every month now about what's coming on and off the channel. And there was a beautiful screening of the film at the New York Film Festival in 2018, and a Q&A afterwards with a couple of the producers and Martin Scorsese and Peter Bogdanovich. And at one point, John Huston's son Danny stood up in the audience and in mimicking his father's voice, gave some opinion that he thought that both Wells and Huston were somewhere up in the clouds sharing, some great vintage bottle of wine, looking down on this premiere screening and, laughing their heads off because of
that would have been great to see. And the thing about Other Side of the Wind, all of Wells's films are ahead of their time, and this is still a new film to us. We've only had it with us for a year and a half, and I've already seen it a few times. It's very strange, but I keep wanting to see it again. And I do think that it's going to take us a while to really understand the film, but I'm glad that it's available now.
Yes, I've had 2 viewings, and I'm looking forward to more.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have some questions from our audience here today, and so we're going to get to those. And I would also remind and suggest to anyone else who hasn't raised their hand yet, please press that participant button at the bottom of your screen, and also the box over on the right-hand side to ask a question. So I'm going to move into that mode here, and here we go.
The initial sound of silence on Zoom.
The initial sound of silence. Okay, so while we're waiting for that to get resolved, let's continue down your list of directors.
Sure.
You mentioned Ernst Lubitsch and those beautiful comedies, often with European settings, but for the most part filmed at Paramount Studios or MGM in the United States. And Lubitsch, always with the impeccably droll wit, maybe a little more continental than Billy Wilder's, was asked at one point whether he preferred shooting on location in Paris or shooting at the beautifully appointed Paramount Studios. And he said, well, I've been to Paris, France, and I've been to Paris Paramount. I prefer Paris Paramount.
And there's a couple, that's great. And there's a couple of Billy Wilder anecdotes. He talks about the Lubitsch touch. he said that the audience doesn't have to be told 2 + 2 = 4. He lets the audience figure that out for himself. And then when Lubitsch died, and I think he was around 60, or he was way too young, at the funeral, I forget whether Wilder said this to Lubitsch or someone said it to Wilder, "No more Lubitsch." The response was even worse than that. No more Lubitsch pictures.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Now I'm getting a signal. I think that we do have a successful questioner.
Cool.
Thanks, Gary. Yep, we got one. Catherine Blanchard, please go ahead and turn on your video, please.
Hold on a sec.
Okay.
We see you.
Catherine?
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah, no, I can have been on a virtual background. First of all, I'm really looking forward to the book. I hadn't realized how usefully you laid it out, and all those recommendations are going to be really very helpful to me, and the way in which you've described the genres too. So I'm actually looking forward to your next book, where you're going to help me understand other genres that you haven't covered in this one. So anyway, I had 2 questions, both of them probably a little silly, but
no, there's no such thing as a silly question.
good. So I'll ask them. One has to do with your, and I'm glad actually you talked about the different formats, which I'm looking forward to learning about. One of the things that I've always been a little confused about, so this is the sort of silly question, which is when you're on an airplane and they always give you that disclaimer on the airplane that this film has been edited, and then all it says is that it's been formatted. And I always sit there and I think, like, why bother telling me that? Like, what is so important about telling me that? So that's one question, and maybe you can answer that one, and then I'll ask my other one.
Sure, and it's a good question. That most likely was brought on by a decision of the Directors Guild of America, because you have filmmakers like Martin Scorsese who are very upset at how their work appears in variety of format. So the Directors Guild wanted to be made clear to the audience, hey, you're just looking at an approximation of this film. This is not really the way it's supposed to look. Most people aren't going to care. In some case, on the airlines, you may see an image that looks like the one you're looking at right now on your computer or your phone, but in reality, the image may originally have been much wider than this. I mean, there may be parts of this office you're supposed to see that you can't see now because it's been reformatted for the delivery service you're looking on, and that's what that's about.
Okay, great. My other question has to do with just all these years you've been in film and all your expertise, and I just wonder, like, I'm nowhere near at all an expert as you are, and when I go to films, I just lose myself in the film, right? And I divorce myself from reality, and even if there's some things that don't logically make sense, I don't really care, right? And I'm just wondering, when you go and you watch a film, are you able to lose yourself in the film, or are you like noticing things and interrupting? I'm just curious to know how you watch film.
Yes and no. It's very funny. When I'm watching a film, I'm often paying attention to what the camera is doing, how it's moving. I'm paying attention to what the editor is doing, how the scenes are being put together. I'm paying attention to the props and I'm paying attention to the music score. All these things that I should not be focusing too much on. But here's the when I see something done impressively, I'll say, wow, that was a great camera movement. That was a clever piece of music. But when I see a performer, an actor, I'm swept away. I don't say, oh, this is an excellent actor doing an excellent interpret. No, I believe it. This is the villain. This is the hero. This is the love interest. This is terrible. They're going to kill each other. I know it's fake, but I buy into it. And that's the power of acting. So eventually I do get swept away, and I'm just as big of a sucker for double plot twists as anybody else. There's a lot of times where my wife gets things that I don't know are coming. A little bit of both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another question. Norma, I'm going to get back to you.
Norma, are you good? Yeah, great. Thank you, Max. That was just terrific, and I've actually seen your book and started to read it, and it's fabulous. But just a couple questions. One, I sort of asked you this the other day. Is there any director or a director or two that you think really are supreme, that for some reason are better than any other director in the universe from this group of people that you've selected? Just be curious who you feel that about, if any, and why. And my other question is, how hard was it to get financing for these films during this period, which is, 50s and earlier? I mean, was it a different world where money was more available or less available? The practicalities of actually getting a film made, because of course now it's so expensive that it seems to be a whole different world.
Absolutely. Well, a parent doesn't want to have favorite children. There are 9 children here, and I hate to have favorites. But I have to say, even though I often complain about, look, there are other directors who were much better with actors than Hitchcock. There are other directors who used locations more realistically than Hitchcock. But for some reason, his stuff continues to just be engrossing. Even if I've seen one of his films over and over again, I always sit down and watch it again. So I think that says a great deal. I just think he's a great starting point, which is why I made him the first in the book. And in relation to finance questions, it depends on the era. In the case of Hollywood directors, people like Lubitsch and Billy Wilder and John Huston, for the most part, were getting their funding from the studios directly. They were either under contract or there was a special deal with the studio to give the money. Once you get into the 1960s, then it becomes a little more fragmented. In the case of Kurosawa, he's getting most of his money from his studio in Japan, which is Toho. Fellini is getting his money from a number of sources in Italy. He has very feisty producers who are raising funds from distributors and various territories. So it becomes a bit of a patch quilt of funding once we get into the 1960s with international co-productions and private investors. But as far as the golden age of Hollywood, all that money came strictly from the studios. It was always there. The directors didn't have to worry where the funding was coming from in the 30s and the 40s and even into the 50s.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So, thank you. Sean has a question, so we're going to put her video on and
Fire away.
mute her. Sean, you're good.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, I'm looking at some of the chat questions, and I know that Joe Feynman asked a question. And let's see, where's Joe's question on here?
At least you know how to use the chat function.
Yeah. He says, please comment on, I can't say this, Dodsukaden and
Dodekaden. Yes, go ahead. Sorry. Sure, comment on that. Absolutely. You're right, Dodekaden. Yeah, actually, that was a good guess. That's very close to the pronunciation. No, that was excellent. That was Kurosawa's first color film. He made it in 1970. It had been 5 years since he had made a film. The Japanese film industry was really going through a decline. It was supposed to start off a series of personal films by Japanese filmmakers. Kurosawa had formed a production company with others, but because Dodekaden was a failure, those other films didn't get made. This was a very personal film. It's not very commercial. It's a segmented, an episodic story dealing with everything. There's comedy in it, but it also deals with poverty issues and family dynamics. And there's a lot of color abstraction in his design. It's definitely worth seeing. I wouldn't recommend it as my first Kurosawa, because it's getting a little into more personal artistic territory. But it's a beautiful film.
And what about, he also asked about clowns, Fellini's Clowns.
The Clowns is a favorite. I think that was my first Fellini picture. I saw that once again when I was way too young. And that was done for Italian television. And even though it was made for TV, it was shot like a feature. So it's absolutely stunning. And it is a look at the dying circus in Italy. And it is told with such magnificence, and it's the staging of the, it's highlighted by, there's a very lengthy sequence towards the end, which is it's a clown's funeral. And so you have this extended sequence where the funeral procession comes through the circus, and then it turns into this crazy Fellini-esque sequence that's quite remarkable. And Nino Rota's score is one of the best scores he wrote for Fellini on that picture.
Oh, that's great. We also have, Kathleen asked another question. She said, is there a book or a story that's not been made into a film you wish would, or a movie that you think should be made or remade?
Wow, that's my goodness. Well, movies that should be remade. It seems like every time. Well, okay, for example, yes, the one that comes to mind is a film that I saw again not long ago. It was Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry, which Richard Brooks brought to the screen in 1960 with Burt Lancaster and Gene Simmons. They were wonderful. And the first half of the film, I think, follows the spirit of the novel. But because of the censorship laws, and you can't offend religious organizations, and this was a film very, very critical of organized religion and a lot of the scam artists going on in tent revivals, they had to clean it all up for the screen and make the last half rather innocent. That's one film I think is crying out to be remade. I mean, you can't get Burt Lancaster back. He was so magnificent. But I think it's a great role for another actor to tackle. That's one.
Okay. And then Martin has the question, and this is the last one I'll ask, is,
sure.
Is there a suggested list of films to watch with new film school students, or a starter list somewhere in the book?
Well, thank you for that. I like to think that the whole book works that way. If you give it to a film school student, it depends. There will be a list of films in each category for them to look at. So it kind of makes the process a lot easier. These are the recommended films that for a director, or recommended books about the director to look at. And so that's why every chapter is designed with a list in mind to make the process easier for students as well as just regular film lovers.
Okay, great. Saul, I'll let you take it back.
Great, thanks, Sean.
Good.
Joan Ullman, please start your video.
Thank you. I did have a question. I wanted to ask you, Max, I enjoyed your talk.
Yeah.
Look forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
I wondered how you rate Woody Allen. I write for Psychology Today, and I'm reviewing his memoir. And I've covered his custody hearings, so I know quite a bit about him. But he's certainly probably the most prolific filmmaker ever. And I wondered what you think of him, where he fits into history.
Certainly, thank you for that question. It's so funny. When Woody Allen, when the media loved him back in the 80s, and when intellectuals loved him in the 80s, and moviegoers loved him, I was always critical. I was saying, he keeps remaking the same movie, and I was so critical of his work. Then, where he's being so viciously attacked on all fronts now, I don't think I've ever discussed Woody Allen as much as I've done over the past year. I've showed clips from him today. I had a course on comedy teams, and I ended with a series of clips of films he made with Diane Keaton. And I've talked about his films in relation to the Jewish image on Hollywood film. I'm sorry, in movies. I think he's a very important director. I mean, 55 films is pretty remarkable. My big complaint about Woody Allen is I wish he'd collaborate more. I think, and in his memoir, which I found very interesting, he basically talks about he writes the stuff pretty quickly and often doesn't get too much feedback. Well, that can be good or bad. I just would like to see him collaborate more, because I think when he did, in the case of working with Marshall Brickman on Manhattan and Annie Hall, I thought the results were a little more interesting. But I think, he's an important director that
you
needs to
think
be
they'll-
recognized for his
Do
work.
you think they'll be shown again in the States?
I would be outraged if they weren't. I think it's outrageous that certain elements are taking it upon themselves to technically ban films as if this was some Stalinist country. I mean, treating us like we're children. I mean, come on, let us decide whether we want to see the film or not. And this idea that we have to hold artists to our own moral accounting, the works have to speak for themselves, and I think it's very dangerous to not allow them. I have to believe that his work will get shown. I mean, HBO has had his work available streaming for a long time, and The Republic is still standing. So time will tell. But thank you for that.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Joe Feynman, do you have another question to ask? I know we have a couple years going. Joe, would you unmute yourself?
Trying.
Okay,
Hello.
there you go.
Hey, Joe.
Hi there. Hi, Max. About those two films, Dodescadon and Clowns. Dodescadon, as you probably know, was supposed to be the sound of the railroad tracks.
Or the trolley track, yeah.
Right.
The trolley tracks.
Mhm.
To me, it was one of the most glorious films that he ever made and very underappreciated. But maybe it's apocryphal story, but he supposedly tried to, because of the failure of the film, commit suicide
Yeah.
in a bathtub.
Yeah, I
after the
think what
making of that
happened.
film.
Yeah, I think he was fired by Toho, and it was coming on the heels of, being fired from Tora, and there was a suicide attempt. It was very, very sad. But yes, the failure of that kind of, it was very demoralizing for him for number of years.
Yeah. And regarding Clowns, at that, somewhat before that, I lived in Rome, and there was a circus that would appear just outside of Rome with a huge tent in the middle of the winter called Cercorama. And it was very much like that movie. And some years later, the documentary appeared. So you can imagine going to see that movie and feeling like I was in the middle of Cercorama when the documentary appeared, and you see all these sort of same clowns drifting through the circus. But it became just about my favorite Fellini film.
It's one that I long to see again, and I'm so glad that it's now. And I think one of the premier DVD labels is offering The Clowns because it was not available in a good format for a while, and I can't wait to revisit it. Fellini sort of saw the cinema as being like a circus, starting from around the time he made La Dolce Vita, and his films became more circus-like moving forward.
Yeah.
But thank you for highlighting that.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Nina, would you please start your video?
Absolutely. Hey there, Max. How are you?
Hello, Nina. Nice
Good
to
to see
meet
you. I have two questions. The first is, I'm curious, what went into your choosing the specific directors you chose to highlight? It would feel, to me, it feels like there are so many others that could well have been on that list. I was wondering if there were particular criteria, whether it's number of films, how much money they made, whatever that is. And a follow-up question to that is, I didn't hear any women on the list, and in this politically correct world we're in, was just curious, again, how that criteria extends to not having women on the list.
Sure. First question, if I were to give you a truthful answer, I was using material that I had spoken most frequently about over my 20 years of lecturing. And because I wasn't quite sure where the because I'd spoken so much about Hitchcock, spoken so much about Billy Wilder. I had done an all-day seminar on Kurosawa. I had done an all-day seminar on Orson Welles. And so the data was readily available. And I thought it was a powerful balance there. You were dealing with directors who were part of the studio system, directors who succeeded in spite of the studio system. And then we managed to get in a few directors who became iconic figures from industries in other countries, like Truffaut and Fellini, and also Kurosawa. And in terms of the maleness of the piece, the era in which we're focusing here primarily is roughly the 1920s through the 60s and beyond. And in terms of Hollywood, it was a male industry. Originally, I did have a chapter on a director who I love to talk about, Ida Lupino. And I do, and she is discussed, actually later in the book, we do have some women. Ida Lupino's work as a director and as an actress is discussed in the film noir section. I felt that by putting her in with the others right now, it was kind of almost, it felt a little condescending, like, oh, okay, honey, we're going to put you in with the men. I felt that was a little condescending because I love her work, but she does get special attention in the other section of the book on film noir. And the section on the pre-code films is very rich with women of that era, actresses in particular who were so important in those films, people who we don't talk about much today, like Kay Francis and Karen Morley, and there were others. So the women are appearing a little bit more towards the latter part of the book, and hopefully at another time. And of course, the irony is I used to program films at the Women's Museum in Washington, D.C. So
that was another reason for the question.
Right. And most of the films that I programmed there were films by women from around the world. At the time, I felt that the best women narrative filmmakers were from other countries. I felt the strongest documentary work was being done here, and the best narrative work was being done internationally.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank
you, Nina. Nice to meet you.
Gary, Max, this will be our last question. SVHV, would you start your video, please?
Yeah, I did.
We see you. We hear you. Hello.
Yep.
Okay, you see me. Okay.
And hear you.
Okay. I was just wondering, I mean, I love the golden age of movies. I love those directors, and I could see those movies again and again and again. I'm wondering if you have any plans for a more modern bunch of directors and movies, because there are some great directors, at least, and movies and genres, Scorsese and the rest of them. Whether you have any plans for an update.
Definitely, the goal is seeing how this book is to come out with another edition. And Scorsese is one that I've spoken a great deal about the films he made with Robert De Niro. He is one of the few major directors who has a kind of stature that some of these others have.
Right.
There are a lot of trendy directors who are treated as rock stars, directors who are, they're recognizable for a specific film that got a lot of acclaim, but they don't have the long track record that a John Huston or a Billy Wilder had. So certainly we'll see what a newer edition brings, because there's so many others to talk about.
True. That's interesting in itself. Yeah.
But thank you.
Okay.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but my head is like just buzzing with films and filmmakers here, and titles I want to revisit and so forth after this great hour here. I will just say one more thing about Woody Allen, since to overlap two different issues that came up in the discussion. Some of you in the group here may know about our efforts to try to get Woody's last film, Rainy Day in New York, screened at the cinema. Unsuccessful, as it turned out. And then in that profile in the New York Times, it was discussed, and we got a little bit of, shall we say, unfriendly mail about our efforts to show Woody's film. But a piece came out in Vanity Fair recently that ironically reports that the only place you can see Woody's movie is on airplanes right now. Apparently it was sold to several airlines. And you can't see it in a movie theater or on any streaming service. But if you're taking an American Airlines flight somewhere, you may well be able to see it. So that's the cinematic irony of the day.
Yeah, and well, you can also purchase. There are DVDs available internationally. I purchased one in overseas.
Oh, so it's out already in the.
It's out already. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go. That's easier and cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
Next week we're going to do Joseph Mankiewicz's very tough, hard hitting, especially for its day, 1950 drama, No Way Out, and we hope as many of you as you can will join us for the discussion of that. And as we always do at the end here, I'm going to swing you back to Sean Moore, who will have a few more things to say about upcoming events.
Thanks, Gary. Max, thank you so much. This was really great, really interesting. Thank you to our audience for being out there with us today. We really appreciate it. We know the weather's getting nice. We know it was Father's Day, so we really, really appreciate that. I do want to let you know that the book will be mailed to you. We've ordered the books, and Max is going to sign them, and then we will mail that out to you. So, expect maybe 2-3 weeks before you get the book. And you can always email us if you have questions about that, but we want to make sure that you get a signed copy of the book. So thank you so much. We're just really super glad that you could join us and that Max was willing to do this, and we raise a little bit of money for the cause, and Max sells some books. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you all. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oops.